Now, to understand what Harrison Blake did in the winter of 1885, you have to understand what 50 cents meant to a boy whose mother counted pennies for bread. Harrison remembered the cold, not the kind that stiffens your fingers or burns your ears, the other kind. The cold of standing outside a dance hall at 7 years old, face pressed against frosted glass, watching children in clean clothes spin and laugh in lantern light while his mother scrubbed the floors inside that same building. His breath had fogged the window. He'd drawn a circle in the frost with his fingertip, just big enough to see through. That circle was the closest he ever got to belonging. 30 years and a fortune later, that circle still lived behind his eyes. He sat in his study on a February evening, firelight throwing shadows across walls lined with books he'd taught himself to read. Silver Creek stretched beyond his window, the valley he'd built his ranch in, the town that called him one of its wealthiest citizens. On his desk lay a printed announcement, cream-colored paper with red ink. Silver Creek Valentine Ball, February 14th, 1885. Admission 50 cents. Nothing to him now. He could buy the entire dance hall and the land beneath it. But 50 cents. Lord. He remembered when 50 cents was 3 days of his mother's washing, when 50 cents meant choosing between lamp oil and sugar, when 50 cents was the exact distance between a boy and joy. Harrison set the announcement down and walked to his window. Across the valley, the late sun caught the schoolhouse in amber light. Miss Alice Morgan stood on the steps, kneeling in the mud to help a small girl retrieve a dropped reader. The book had landed spine down in a puddle, and Alice picked it up without hesitation, wiping it on her own skirt, her only good skirt, the gray wool one she wore every day, and handed it back with a smile that made the child laugh. Harrison's hand tightened on the window frame. He'd been watching Alice Morgan for months. Not in any way that would set tongues wagging, but in the way a man watches someone who reminds him that goodness still exists in the world. He'd seen her stay late for struggling students, seen her walk immigrant children home through rain, seen her treat every child in that schoolhouse as if they mattered equally. And every time, something in his chest pulled tight, like a rope he didn't dare follow to its anchor. He turned from the window. Outside, a dry February wind drove dust against the glass and rattled the loose rail on the fence line, the fence between his land and the poorer homesteads to the south. He'd never fixed that gap. The children used it as a shortcut to school, their small boots wearing a path through his pasture every morning, and he'd sooner sell the whole ranch than close it. Harrison picked up the announcement, folded it into his coat pocket, and reached for his hat. By the time he saddled his horse, the sun had dropped below the ridge, and Silver Creek lay quiet under a sky the color of bruised plums. He didn't ride toward the committee hall. He rode toward Hadley's general store, where nobody would think twice about a rancher buying supplies after dark. Tom Hadley was sweeping the front porch when Harrison dismounted. The store clerk was a quiet man, the kind who kept confidences the way a good safe keeps gold locked tight and never rattled. "Evenin', Mr. Blake. Something I can help you with." Harrison stepped inside. The store smelled of coffee beans, leather, and the faint sweetness of penny candy in glass jars. He removed his hat and set the announcement on the counter. "Tom, I need you to do something for me, and I need your word it stays between us." Tom set down his broom. "You got it. The Valentine ball. 50 cents admission." Harrison reached into his coat and laid a leather pouch on the counter. It landed heavy. "I want to buy 200 tickets. Every one of them goes to a poor family's children, ranch hands' kids, the orphans at the church home, the immigrant families along the creek, every child who wouldn't otherwise walk through that door." Tom stared at the pouch, then at Harrison. 200 tickets. "That's $100. Mr. Blake, I can count." Tom. "Yes, sir." Tom folded his arms, studying Harrison with the careful gaze of a man deciding how much to say. "And the name on the donation, anonymous. That's all anyone needs to know." Harrison's jaw tightened, and his voice dropped to something quieter than command, closer to prayer. "I don't want thanks. I don't want a speech at the dance. I just want those children in that room." Tom nodded slowly. He was a man who understood when a thing ran deeper than money. "I'll see to it personal. Start distributing tomorrow morning." Harrison turned to leave, then stopped at the door. Through the dark, he could see the schoolhouse, its windows gone black now. Alice Morgan would be walking home along the creek path, lantern in hand, the same path she walked every evening. "Tom, sir, make sure Miss Morgan's students get their tickets first. She'll know which families need them most." He mounted his horse and rode home under a sky thick with stars. In his chest, something old and tight loosened just a fraction, like a fist that had been clenched for 30 years finally opening. One finger at a time, his mother had told him once, in her broken English, with her hands still red from washing. Someday, you open doors, not just look through. Tonight, he'd bought 200 doors. The first ticket arrived at Alice Morgan's schoolhouse on a Tuesday morning, tucked inside an envelope with no return address. By noon, 6 more had appeared delivered to families along the creek, left at doorsteps, pressed into the hands of children who'd never owned anything printed on cardstock. Alice watched it happen the way a woman watches weather change, first with curiosity, then with wonder. Little May Chen held her ticket against her chest with both hands, the red paper bright against her faded calico dress. "Miss Morgan," she whispered, eyes wide as new pennies. "I never been to a party before." Alice knelt beside her and straightened the girl's collar with careful fingers. "Then we'll make sure you're ready for this one." May. By week's end, 200 tickets had found their way to every poor family in Silver Creek. Ranch hands' kids, orphans from the church home, the Gustafson children whose father had died in a mine collapse, the Hernandez siblings who still spoke more Spanish than English. Every child who'd ever stood outside the bright circle of community belonging now held a piece of red paper that said, "You're invited." Someone had done this. Someone with deep pockets and a deeper conscience. Alice sat at her desk that evening, lamplight pooling gold on her hands, and made a list of who could afford such generosity. The banker, Mr. Caldwell, the cattle baron's nephew, James Whitfield, Harrison Blake, the millionaire rancher on the ridge. She studied the names, pencil tapping against the wood, and felt the old familiar ache settle behind her ribs. She'd been courted by wealthy men. She remembered the banker's son, his cologne too strong, his hand on her elbow too possessive, his laugh too loud when she mentioned her students, as though educating poor children was a charming little hobby she'd eventually outgrow. She remembered James Whitfield offering to fund her schoolhouse and then suggesting, between bites of steak, that she teach fewer immigrant children in exchange. Every man with money had shown her the same truth. Their generosity came with conditions, and those conditions always circled back to themselves. Alice caught her reflection in the dark window and realized she'd set 2 teacups on her desk out of habit. She put the second one back in the cupboard, the way she did every evening, and pretended the gesture didn't mean anything. Whoever bought those tickets wanted nothing in return. That was the part that wouldn't let her rest. She pinned her one good brooch to her collar and studied her face in the glass. Valentine's evening was 3 days away. She would attend not just as chaperone, but as investigator. "Who are you?" she whispered. The question settled into the silence of the empty schoolhouse like a stone dropped into still water. The Valentine ball began the way Silver Creek events always did, with the prominent families arriving first, the women in silk, the men in pressed shirts, everyone settling into their usual places like water finding its level. Then the doors opened wider. They came in a flood. Children in patched dresses and borrowed ribbons, boys with slicked hair and scrubbed hands. May Chen, in a dress her mother had stayed up 3 nights sewing from flour sacks and hope. Orphans from the church home walked in together, a tight, nervous cluster, the youngest gripping the oldest's hand. A boy named Samuel Ward, 10 years old. Hair the color of straw. Shoes held together with twine stood frozen in the doorway, staring at the lanterns and the red paper hearts as though he'd stepped into a painting he'd only ever seen from the outside. Then a red-haired girl named Penny grabbed his arm and hauled him toward the fiddle music, and Samuel Ward danced his first dance with his mouth hanging open and his eyes full of light. After that, the dam broke. 200 children who'd never attended a social event poured into the warmth and the music and the belonging. They danced with the clumsy joy of creatures set free. They ate cake with both hands, yellow cake with white frosting, the kind that costs nothing to make and everything to share. They laughed in a way that made the walls vibrate, and the sound was so raw and unguarded it changed the very air in the room. Alice stood near the punch table, and her throat closed tight. She'd taught many of these children. She knew which ones went hungry on Mondays. She knew which ones wore the same shirt 3 days running. She knew Mei Chen practiced her letters on slate because her family couldn't afford paper. And here they all were spinning, laughing, belonging, and the happiness on their faces was so fierce and so fragile it almost hurt to witness. Now, here's what nobody in that room knew. Harrison Blake stood at the far wall, hat in his hands, watching. But he wasn't watching a Valentine ball. He was watching 200 versions of himself finally walk through the door. His eyes were bright, not with pride, with something older and more painful. Memory, recognition, the ghost of a 7-year-old boy who'd drawn a circle in the frost just to see inside, and now stood in a room full of children who would never have to. Alice had been scanning the crowd for someone claiming credit, someone accepting praise, someone performing generosity for an audience. Nobody was. But Harrison Blake stood apart from the wealthy families, his gaze fixed on the children with an expression she couldn't catalog. It wasn't charity. It wasn't satisfaction. It was the expression of a man watching something heal. Their eyes met across the room of dancing children. Harrison looked away first too quickly, the way a man does when he's been caught feeling something he doesn't know how to explain. His hand tightened on his hat brim, and Alice saw his jaw work once, hard, as if swallowing something back. Her hand stilled on her glass. She didn't know yet, but she'd started looking. The morning after the ball, Alice began her investigation with the precision of a woman who grades 40 compositions a week and can spot a copied sentence at 20 paces. She started with the wealthy families. Over the course of 3 days, she visited every prominent household in Silver Creek, and each conversation stripped another layer of hope from her faith in rich men's goodness. Mrs. Caldwell, the banker's wife, curled her lip over imported china and said, "Someone is filling those children's heads with ideas above their station." James Whitfield called the whole affair a waste of good tickets and suggested the money would have been better spent on new church pews. Judge Whitfield's wife wished aloud that those children had stayed home where they belonged. One by one, Alice eliminated every wealthy name in Silver Creek. Not a single one possessed the kind of compassion those tickets represented. After each visit, Alice walked faster, her jaw set tighter. Her handwriting in the small notebook she carried grew sharper, the pencil pressing harder into the page, as though the force of her disappointment needed somewhere physical to go. She'd been courted by these families' sons and nephews and associates. She'd sat through their dinners, endured their compliments, and watched their generosity evaporate the moment the audience left the room. Whoever bought those tickets wanted nothing. And in a valley full of men who wanted everything, that distinction burned like a signal fire. On Thursday afternoon, Alice walked the long way home past Harrison Blake's ranch. The fence line stretched along the road, post and rail, solid and well-maintained, except for one section near the schoolhouse path, a gap wide enough for a child to pass through. She'd seen children use this shortcut for years, their small boots wearing a groove through Harrison's pasture. Any other rancher in the valley would have nailed it shut and posted a trespass warning. Harrison Blake had left it open. She stopped walking. She stood in the cold February wind and stared at that gap in the fence. And something shifted inside her, not a conclusion yet, but the ground tilting toward one. She remembered his face at the ball. Not pride, not performance. Something that looked like a man standing inside a memory he'd carried for decades. That evening, Alice pulled the dance committee's ledger from the church office. The payment for 200 tickets traced to a cash transaction at Hadley's General Store. She closed the ledger and pressed her hand flat against the cover, feeling her own heartbeat through the leather. Tomorrow she'd visit Tom Hadley, and she was not entirely sure she was ready for what she'd find. Tom Hadley was not a man built for deception. Alice saw it the moment she walked through his door, the way his eyes shifted, the way he suddenly found urgent business reorganizing canned peaches on the back shelf. Mr. Hadley, I'm not here to make trouble. Alice folded her hands on the counter, the way she did when a student was deciding whether to tell the truth. Patient, unblinking, certain. Don't rightly know what you mean, Miss Morgan. 200 Valentine ball tickets, paid for in cash, at this store. Tom's hands went still on a can of peaches. He didn't turn around. I'm not asking you to break a confidence, Alice said, her voice gentling. I respect that someone wanted this kept quiet, and I'll tell you something. Mr. Hadley, that silence tells me more about his character than any name would. Tom set the can down. He turned slowly, and Alice saw something she hadn't expected, not guilt, but loyalty. The fierce, quiet loyalty of a man honoring a promise he believed in down to his bones. Ma'am, I gave my word. Can't go back on that. Not for anyone. I understand, but I'll say this much. Tom's voice dropped, and he leaned forward on the counter as though sharing something precious. The man who bought those tickets didn't do it for thanks. He did it because he remembered. That's all I can say, and it's all you'll need. Because he remembered. Alice walked home along the creek path with those 3 words turning in her mind like stones in a current. She sat at her schoolhouse desk as the light faded and laid out everything she knew. A man who remembered. A man wealthy enough for 200 tickets, but who didn't sit with the wealthy families at the ball. A man who watched the children with an expression of memory, not charity. A man who left his fence open so poor children could walk to school. Harrison Blake. The realization didn't arrive like a thunderclap. It arrived like dawn, slow, warm, undeniable. Alice felt it rise through her chest, and her breath caught, and the lamplight flickered as though the room itself had shifted on its foundation. She pressed her hands flat on the desk and reconsidered everything she'd seen in 2 years of living in Silver Creek. Harrison paying full price at the widow's bakery when every other rancher haggled for discount. Harrison settling old Samuel Green's doctor bill she'd overheard Doc Mercer mention it once, quietly astonished. Harrison attending church socials, but sitting near the back, near the working families, never with the Caldwells and Whitfields in the front pew. A pattern of invisible generosity, stitched so quietly through the fabric of this town that nobody had thought to follow the thread. Alice stood at her window as dusk settled purple and gold over Silver Creek. Her gaze traveled to the ranch on the ridge, where a single light burned in a study window, a man alone in a big house, giving everything away and keeping nothing for himself. She pressed her fingertips to the glass. The window was cold, and she thought of a boy pressing his face against frosted glass, drawing a circle just to see inside. And she understood with sudden, aching clarity why Harrison Blake hid his goodness. He wasn't hiding generosity. He was hiding the wound that made it necessary. She found him after the Thursday town meeting, when the hall had emptied and the lamplight burned low. Harrison was collecting his hat from the bench near the door, moving with the careful ease of a man who'd learned to leave rooms without being noticed. Mr. Blake, he turned. Alice stood 3 paces away, her hands clasped in front of her, her expression equal parts tenderness and steel. He'd seen that look on her face before in the schoolhouse, when a child was struggling to speak a truth that frightened them. Miss Morgan, he tipped his hat. Evenin', I know it was you. Her voice was quiet, but certain. The way she stated facts to her students, not accusation. Simply truth laid bare. The tickets, all 200 of them. Harrison's hand tightened on his hat brim. For a moment, the composure he'd built across 30 years of self-made success flickered like a candle fighting wind. "I don't know what you're—" "Mr. Hadley didn't tell me your name. He didn't have to." Alice stepped closer. "I watched you at the ball. Mr. Blake, every other wealthy man in that room looked at those children like an inconvenience. You looked at them like you were watching something sacred." The word landed between them. Sacred. Harrison's throat moved, and his eyes went bright. And Alice saw the exact moment his walls began to give. Why hide such generosity? The question hung in the lamplight, and something in Harrison broke not violently, not dramatically, but the way ice breaks on a creek in early spring, quietly, inevitably, because the warmth had finally become too much to hold back. "My mother was a poor immigrant." His voice came rough, like a door opening on rusted hinges for the first time in years. "She washed clothes for wealthy families in Pennsylvania. I grew up watching their children have everything parties, new shoes, birthday cake. We had none of it. Not a crumb." He paused. His jaw worked hard, and he looked at the floor. "I remember standing outside a dance hall when I was 7 years old, face pressed against the glass, watching children spin in the light while my mother scrubbed floors on the other side of the same wall." He raised his eyes to hers. "I swore if I ever had money, I'd make sure children like the boy I was never had to stand outside looking in. That's all it was. Miss Morgan, I ain't a hero. I just remember what 50 cents feels like when you don't have it." Alice didn't speak immediately. She let his words settle the way snow settles on still ground, quiet, accumulating, changing the shape of everything beneath. She heard Mei Chen's voice in her memory, small and wondering. "I never been to a party before." She saw Samuel Ward frozen in the doorway, shoes tied with twine, staring at the lanterns. She saw 200 children dancing, and she saw the 7-year-old boy who'd made it possible standing in front of her now, 30 years older and still carrying the cold of that window against his skin. "Mr. Blake, I've been courted by every prosperous man in this valley." Her voice was steady, and her eyes held his without wavering. They were generous when someone was watching, and selfish the moment they weren't. "I've spent years looking for a man who remembers where he came from and uses his wealth to help others instead of himself." She paused, and the pause held the weight of every empty teacup, every walked home alone evening, every suitor she'd turned away knowing he wasn't enough. "I believe I've found him." Harrison stared at her. The woman he'd admired for months admired from the safe side of silence, from the far side of a room, from the careful distance of a man who didn't believe he deserved what he wanted was standing in front of him. And she was the one who'd closed the distance. Alice reached out and took his hand, not shyly, not tentatively, the way a woman takes hold of something she's searched for across years of disappointment and has no intention of ever letting go. "I've been watching you teach those children for months, Miss Morgan," Harrison whispered. "Wishing I had the courage to speak. Alice's smile broke through slow and warm, like the first thaw of spring reaching frozen ground. Then it's a good thing one of us did. Spring came to Silver Creek the way forgiveness comes slowly at first, then all at once. The ice on the creek broke in late February. By March, wildflowers pushed through the mud along the banks, stubborn and bright, and the dust storms surrendered to skies so blue they looked painted by a hand steadier than nature's. Harrison and Alice walked those banks together, evening after evening, and the walking was where they learned each other not through declarations, but through the slow, honest accumulation of shared attention. Alice told him about Mei Chen's progress, how the girl had moved from slate to paper and was writing full sentences now, each one neater than the last. Harrison listened the way few men listen, leaning forward, asking questions that proved he'd been paying attention not just to Alice, but to every child she'd ever mentioned. "The Hernandez boy," he said one evening, hands in his pockets, watching the creek catch the last light. "The one who reads above his level. He's still having trouble with the older boys at recess." Alice stopped walking. "How did you know about that?" Harrison shrugged, but his ears went pink. "I noticed things." She visited his ranch and discovered what the town had never bothered to see. Immigrant workers paid fair wages when every other operation in the valley cut corners. A small schoolroom in the barn where their children learned English on Saturday mornings. A widow's garden plot on his south acreage, given rent-free because, as Harrison put it, the land wasn't doing nothing useful just sitting there. Harrison visited Alice's classroom. He sat in the back row, too large for the small desk, his knees pressing against the underside like a grown oak crammed into a flower pot. Alice handed him a reader and asked if he'd help the younger students with their pronunciation. He read aloud. His voice was low and careful, shaping each word with the deliberate attention of a man who'd taught himself to read from borrowed books by candlelight. When he stumbled over chrysanthemum, Mei Chen leaned across the aisle, touched his sleeve, and said softly, "It's chrysanthemum, Mr. Blake." Harrison looked at the girl, this child, whose ticket to the Valentine ball he'd bought, whose family he'd never met, whose patience with his stumbling was offered as freely as breath. And he said, "Much obliged, Miss Chen. I won't forget it." Mei Chen beamed, and Alice, standing in the doorway with her hand pressed to her mouth, felt something lock into place inside her chest with the quiet certainty of a key turning in a lock it was always meant to open. The children from the ball became their bridge in the weeks that followed. They ran between schoolhouse and ranch, carrying wildflowers and notes and breathless reports delivered with the complete lack of discretion that only children possess. Miss Morgan smiled when Mr. Blake brought apples. Mr. Blake's ears turn red when Miss Morgan talks to him. The town noticed. Some whispered behind gloved hands. Most simply smiled. And a few, the ones who'd stood in that dance hall watching 200 children discover joy, for the first time nodded as though something that was always meant to happen had finally found its way home. On a June morning, warm with sage and new grass, Harrison rode to the schoolhouse with a fistful of wildflowers and a question he'd been carrying since the night Alice took his hand in the empty meeting hall. She said yes before he finished asking. They married on a Saturday in June, under a sky so wide and clear it seemed like the whole frontier was holding its breath. The ceremony was simple. No silk, no imported flowers, no speeches from important men. Just a wooden arch Harrison had built with his own hands, draped with wildflowers the children had gathered that morning. Alice wore her mother's lace collar. Harrison wore a new shirt and the expression of a man who'd spent 30 years watching life through glass and had finally been invited inside. Every family whose children had danced at the Valentine ball filled the meadow behind the schoolhouse. Ranch hands stood in clean boots beside immigrant families in their Sunday best. Orphans from the church home sat cross-legged in the front row, Penny with a wildflower tucked behind each ear. Mei Chen, 10 years old and fierce with purpose, placed a crown of daisies on Alice's chair and declared it fit for a queen. Samuel Ward, the boy who'd stood frozen in the dance hall doorway 4 months earlier, carried the rings on a small wooden tray he'd sanded smooth himself. His shoes still had twine in them. His face had the serious dignity of a child entrusted with something important. Tom Hadley stood near the back, arms folded, wearing the quiet smile of a man who'd kept a secret that turned into something beautiful. Now, I want to tell you what happened after, because the best part of this story isn't the Valentine ball, and it isn't the wedding, and it isn't even the look on Harrison Blake's face when Alice Morgan took his hand that evening in the empty meeting hall. The best part is what those 200 children carried with them when they grew up. They told their own children, every one of them. They told them about the millionaire who remembered being poor, about the night the dance hall doors opened wide and every child in Silver Creek walked through. No matter whose family they belonged to, no matter what language they spoke at home, no matter whether their shoes had holes or their dresses were sewn from flour sacks. And one of those children, Samuel Ward, the orphan boy who'd stood frozen in the doorway until Penny pulled him onto the dance floor, grew into a rancher, a quiet, steady, good one. And every winter, without telling a soul, he bought supplies for the newest immigrant families arriving in Silver Creek: flour, sugar, lamp oil, warm blankets. He left them on doorsteps before dawn, the way Harrison Blake had taught him, through the simple act of 200 tickets. That generosity works best not as performance, but as promise. When folks asked Samuel why he did it, he'd tip his hat and say, "A man helped me once, didn't ask for credit. Figure the least I can do is pass it along." Folks in Silver Creek learned something that Valentine's evening in 1885, and they never forgot it, and they never stopped passing it down through the generations like a lantern carried from hand to hand through the dark. True wealth isn't measured by what you own. It's measured by how many lives you touch. And if you ever find yourself riding through that valley, you'll notice something about the fences between the homesteads. They've got gaps in them left open on purpose, rails pulled aside, wide enough for any child to pass through. Nobody in Silver Creek has ever seen fit to close them.